This will be a series of videos on my master's thesis. My master's thesis was on the subject of indirect compelled doxastic coercion. In part one of this project, I defined different forms of coercion. I outline adaptive preferences. I argue that indirect compelled doxastic coercion is the unconscious element in adaptive preferences, and I contextualize these concepts in the Black experience. In part two, I demonstrate how certain segregation policies are a mix of direct practical coercion and indirect compelled doxastic coercion, or indoctrination. In the final section, I argue that under desert theory, coercion negates responsibility. So the intent of this paper is to demolish the popular notion that Black Americans of low economic status freely choose to live as criminals, contributing to criminality and the social instability of their environment. When this concept becomes a talking point, it takes the form low-income Black Americans willfully allow themselves to be poor, and because these individuals choose to engage in this lifestyle, they are autonomous and wholly responsible for their state of affairs. This claim ignores the joint relationship between the individual and environment. A host of environmental factors can have significant impacts on the behaviors and mindsets of individuals. These factors are also discounted by the first fault logic of moral desert theory. Similarly, in Western society, it is believed that women who buy makeup and other various objectifying forms of attire do so because they want to, when in reality they are simply conforming to a world where their autonomy is restricted and dominated by men. It is not reasonable to conflate the desire for something and the ability to attain such a thing with autonomy. In Nussbaum's Women in Human Development, the Capabilities approach, she describes Jayama, a poor Indian woman who works a low-wage job. Jayama may desire a low-wage job and she may be able to attain it, but her desire explains her behavior only when we ignore the fact that this is possibly the only work that she has access to. Similarly, in D. Watkins' Poor Black People Don't Work, lessons from a dope dealer from his youth as a drug dealer, when structural inequalities of his environment are ignored, the claim is made that he may desire to sell drugs, ignoring the possibility that he only sold drugs because he had no other opportunities, particularly opportunities to work in areas that are not criminal enterprises. When these individuals are assumed to have autonomy, they are likewise assumed to be fully responsible for their actions. And according to moral desert theory, one is fully responsible for one's actions regardless of context, except in certain circumstances like coercion. This allows the observer to blame an area's population for its lack of resources without looking at the cause or origin of resource scarcity. Urban segregation policies and the institutionalized origins of resource scarcity in urban areas have long coerced practically and indirectly. In the second half of this paper, I focus on how the direct practical coercion of segregation policies and the effects, of course, which still exists to this day, has led to a form of indoctrination, or have led to a form of indoctrination. The indirect coercion I'm referring to is called indirect compelled doxastic coercion. Within this form of coercion, an individual's rationality is pushed to the periphery and beliefs are implanted in the individual's mind. The indirect coercion motivates and even forces agents to follow social and financial incentives associated with success in their environment. Individuals are motivated towards incentives that are illegal and harmful, making Faustian bargains in order to survive. I use 3 examples. 1, a child raised in the blood gang. At an early age, before rationality has developed in any way, parents teach children the core values of being a gang member. 2, I use the example of the salon writer and former drug dealer D. Watkins. And later, in the section on responsibility, I use the example of Dominic Ongwen, a former child soldier. So if coercion negates responsibility, according to desert theory, and indirect compelled Doxastic coercion is a component of adaptive preferences, then having adaptive preferences also negates one's responsibility according to desert theory. So adaptive preferences are the natural consequence of the unconscious coercion that motivates individuals to satisfy desires in an environment of limited resources. Indirect compelled Doxastic coercion occurs unconsciously because proving the existence of the autonomy necessary for assigning responsibility becomes difficult. The moral desert theory considers that conditions necessary for the removal of the agent from the moral community are created by indirect compelled Doxastic coercion. This manifests in adaptive preferences in some low-income Black Americans, which prevents them from being judged under a desert theory of morality. Individuals born in environments of limited resources may be raised to and raised by others, too, who believe that one must do certain things to survive. In the example of the blood gang, one survives through crime. Even if the parents born in this environment don't raise their children to believe committing crimes is the only means of survival, the previous direct coercion produces the same result. Direct coercion in this context takes many forms, including Jim Crow and redlining, forming modern-day urban concentration camps, mass incarceration, discrimination against home buyers, and racial profiling. Environmental factors such as job scarcity and peers may compel one to sell drugs for a living as a means of survival. This way of living is the direct and indirect compelled Doxastic coercion becoming manifest in adaptive preferences. Adaptive preferences occur when one adapts their feasible set to what is attainable within that feasible set. D. Watkins, the blood baby, and Giyama prefer to sell drugs, live in gang life, and work a low-wage job, but only because they have no other options. McMyler defines coercion as the act of forcing or threatening someone to do something they would otherwise not have done. It involves one or a group of agents targeting an individual or group and serving as a stimulus for them to act in a certain way, either by threat or force. I define coercion as an individual or a group being forced to do something they otherwise would not have done. This second definition allows for environmental coercion or natural constraints as coercion. Some individuals are coerced in two ways: directly through indirect compelled Doxastic coercion and adaptive preferences, and directly through environmental features like mass incarceration. I argue that especially after significant legislative changes like the repeal of Jim Crow laws, endemic adaptive preferences continue to grow in low-income Black populations due to the coercive nature of segregation. The cycle of coercion is necessarily linked to the cycle of urban poverty. While direct coercion still occurs, I put more effort into history, because understanding how the structures came to be is just as important as understanding the structures that exist today.